Part 3 of 4 Weeks in the Trenches. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. 4 Weeks in the Trenches by Fritz Kreisler. Our hopes of getting a little rest and respite from the fighting were soon shattered, for a scouting aeroplane brought news that the Russians were again advancing in overwhelming strength. Our commanding general, coming to the conclusion that with reduced and weakened forces at his command he could not possibly offer any effective resistance to a renewed onslaught, had determined to fall back slowly before their pressure. The consequence was a series of retreating battles for us, which lasted about 10 days, and which constituted what is now called the Battle of Lemberg. We were terribly outnumbered by the Russians, and in order to extricate our army and prevent it from being surrounded and cut off, we constantly had to retreat, one detachment taking up positions to resist the advancing Russians, trying to hold them at all costs in order to give the rest of the army sufficient time to retire to safety. This maneuvering could not, of course, be carried out without forces guarding the rear and covering the retreat, suffering sometimes terrible losses. These were depressing days, with rain and storm adding to the gloom. The men tramped wearily, hanging their heads, ashamed and humiliated by the retreat, the necessity of which they could not grasp, having, as they thought, successfully repulsed the enemy. It was difficult to make them understand that our regiment was only a cog in a huge wheel of the Austrian fighting machine, and that with a battle line extending over many miles, it was quite natural that the partial successes could take place and yet the consideration of general strategy necessitate a retreat. Our arguing made little impression on the men, for they only shook their heads and said, "We were victorious. We should have gone on." The spirit of retreating troops is vastly different from that shown by an advancing army, and it was probably in recognition of this well-known psychological state that our general staff had in the beginning attacked the Russians wherever they could, in spite of the overwhelming superiority of the foe. But the reinforcements the Russians were able to draw upon had swelled their ranks so enormously that any attack would have been little short of madness. The real hardships and privations for us began only now. The few roads of Galicia, which at best are in bad condition, through the constant passing of heavy artillery and wagons of all kinds following each other in endless procession through constant rains, had become well nigh impassable, the heavy mud constituting an additional impediment to the marching troops. In order to get all of the train carrying provisions out of the possible reach of a sudden raid by Russian cavalry, it had to be sent miles back of us, so as not to interfere with the movement of the troops. This caused somewhat of an interruption in the organization of the commissary department, and very little food reached the troops, and that only at very long intervals. The distribution of food to an army, even in peace and under the best conditions, is very complicated and a difficult undertaking. Provisions are shipped from the interior to the important railway centers, which serve as huge army depots and form the basis from which the different army corps draw their provisions and from which they are constantly replenished. They in turn supply the divisions and brigades, wherefrom the regiments and battalions draw their provisions. So it is seen that the great aorta which leads from the interior to the big depots slowly subdivides itself into smaller arteries and feeders until they reach the ultimate destination, the extreme front. This distribution of food had now become a formidable task, in consequence of the unforeseen movements and diversions which were forced upon us by the unexpected developments of the battle, and it often happened that food supplies intended for a certain detachment would reach their destination only after the departure of that detachment. My platoon had by this time shrunk from 55 men to about 34, and those remaining had become very hardened, efficient, and fit. It is astonishing how quickly the human organism adjusts itself, if need be, to the most difficult circumstances. So far as I was concerned, for instance, I adapted myself to the new life without any trouble at all, responding to the unusual demands upon me automatically, as it were. My rather impaired eyesight improved in the open, with only wide distances to look at. I found that my muscles served me better than ever before. I leaped and ran and supported fatigue that would have appalled me under other circumstances. In the field, all neurotic symptoms seem to disappear as by magic, and one's whole system is charged with energy and vitality. Perhaps this is due to the open-air life with its simplified standards, freed from all the complex exigencies of society's laws and unhampered by conventionalities, as well to the constant throb of excitement caused by the activity, the adventure, and the uncertainty of fate. The very massing together of so many individuals with every will merged into one that strives with gigantic effort towards a common end, and the consequent simplicity and directness of all purpose, seem to release and unhinge all of the primitive aboriginal forces stored in the human soul, and tend to create the indescribable atmosphere of exaltation which envelops everything and everybody as with a magic cloak. It is extraordinary how quickly suggestions of luxury, culture, refinement, in fact all of the gentle aspects of life which one had considered to be an integral part of one's life, are quickly forgotten, and more than that, not even missed. Centuries drop from one, and one becomes a primeval man, nearing the cave dweller in an incredible short time. For 21 days I went without taking off my clothes, sleeping on wet grass or in mud, or in the swamps, wherever need be, and with nothing but my cape to cover me. Nothing disturbs one. One night, while sleeping, we were drenched to the skin by torrential rains. We never stirred, but waited for the sun to dry us out again. Many things considered necessities of civilization simply drop out of existence. A toothbrush was not imaginable. We ate instinctively when we had food, with our hands. If we had stopped to think of it all, we should have thought it ludicrous to use knife and fork. We were all looking like shaggy, lean wolves from the necessity of subsisting on next to nothing. I remember having gone for more than 3 days at a time without any food whatsoever, and many a time we had to lick the new dew from the grass for want of water. A certain fierceness arises in you, an absolute indifference to anything the world holds except your duty of fighting. You are eating a crust of bread, and a man is shot dead in the trench next to you. You look calmly at him for a moment, and then you go on eating your bread. Why not? There is nothing to be done. In the end you talk of your own death with as little excitement as you would of a luncheon engagement. There's nothing left in your mind but the fact that hordes of men to whom you belong are fighting against other hordes, and your side must win. My memory of these days is very much blurred, every day being pretty nearly the same as the preceding one, fatiguing marches, little rest, and comparatively little fighting. It is quite possible that our commander tried to divide the work of the troops in a just manner, and that in consequence of my regiment having borne the brunt of 2 terrible attacks, and having suffered considerable loss, we were now temporarily withdrawn from the fighting line, and not once during these days were assigned to the duty of a rear guard. Consequently, we had only a few unimportant skirmishes in these days. Twice, while guarding the flank through having to repulse attacks of Cossacks, and once being harassed by an armored automobile. But the movements of an automobile being confined to the road, we had no difficulty in avoiding its fire, and as for the Cossacks, with their eternal feigned attacks, we had reached the point where we almost ignored them. We were in the first days of September, and upon reaching the swamps near Gradec, south of Lemberg, a determined stand was decided upon by our commanding general. It seemed the most precipitous place for a formidable defence, there being only a few roads through otherwise impassable swamps. On September the 6th, my battalion was ordered to take up a position commanding a defile which formed one of the possible approaches for the enemy. Here we awaited the Russians, and they were not long in coming. First they violently shelled our position and silenced one of our batteries. Finding their artillery fire did not draw any answer from our side, they attempted to storm our position by means of frontal infantry attacks, combined with occasional raids of Cossacks, which were always repulsed. Finally, the Russian infantry succeeded in establishing a number of trenches, the one opposite us not more than 500 yards away. It was the first time we had come in close touch with the Russians, almost within hailing distance, and with the aid of our field glasses we could occasionally even get a glimpse of their faces and recognize their features. We stayed 4 days opposite each other, neither side gaining a foot of ground. It was there and then that I made a curious observation. After the 2nd day we had almost grown to know each other. The Russians would laughingly call over to us, and the Austrians would answer. The salient feature of these 3 days' fighting was the extraordinary lack of hatred. In fact, it is astonishing how little actual hatred exists between fighting men. One fights fiercely and passionately, mass against mass, but as soon